So, Jenny, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We will directly start asking our questions. So, to start us off, could you briefly walk us through the purpose and structure of this research, what you set out to explore, how you approached it, and how you went about selecting participants for the study?
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity, first of all, to talk more in-depthly about the basic income for the arts scheme in Ireland. The purpose, I suppose, of this research was, I suppose, to give some background for people listening, is that Ireland initiated a pilot scheme of a basic income for artists post-pandemic. So starting in 2022. And alongside that, there is a research element to assess the impact of it after its 3 year, as it's being a pilot. So every 6 months, the recipients, the 2,000 recipients that were selected through a lottery, complete a survey. And this survey is quite extensive. There's a lot of sections and themes within that, to try and assess. So I suppose the purpose of the qualitative interviews then is to provide, I suppose, fill in the gaps in understanding things like when artists say they spend 2 more hours or 8 more hours actually a week on their creative practice. What is the impact of that in their everyday lives? What does that mean? What can we glean from their everyday lives of the impact of that? So the purpose really was to explore the professional, personal and kind of societal impact of the basic income for artists. That was really what I set out to do, and then I created some research questions around that. So to think about, how does basic income support affect the financial stability of artists and creative workers? What changes occur in their artistic output and creativity? And kind of thinking about how does BIA support or influence their well-being or their mental health? And then kind of what are the broader societal and community impacts? And for me, those kind of questions complemented the quantitative data to try and dig deep into people's everyday lives, to try and understand the impact it was having across art forms, for different demographics. That really kind of goes into the approach I took was really thematic. It was I looked at the kind of themes that were within the survey and then tried to kind of correspond and complement those, but also try and really explore perhaps their reflective and future aspirations and also the social kind of impact. So we agreed kind of to look at income stability. So to gather those stories of kind of financial stability, what was the impact of having this continuous consistent payment over a specific period of time, to look at practice development, what impact did it have on their creative input and output, and to think about the recognition and opportunities that they've been able to undertake as a result of basic income. And then community engagement and social impact was another theme that we explored, and then their reflective and future orientated aspirations. So that was really the kind of scope, a thematic scope of the research, was to really try and cover those areas that were coming up that were covered also in the quantitative research. And then selection was really interesting and a hard one, because 2,000 recipients are in receipt of the basic income, which has just recently been extended for 6 months. So they'll have 3.5 years in total. And that's to allow more research to be published, I suppose, before, and to assess the impact. So they've got an extra 6 months only recently announced by our minister. But so the selection of participants there was 2,000 recipients. They are all communicated with through a portal by the Department of Communications, Culture and Media, or Sport. Don't ask, it's changed names since I was dealing with them, but it's more recently. But so the idea was to communicate with the 2,000 recipients. They were all given the opportunity to register their interest to participate in the qualitative interviews, and they were given an information sheet, and then they would respond, those who were interested. So 295 recipients were interested in doing these interviews. which is far too much for the time frame that I had. So for me, 80 recipients was a realistic goal to try and interview. So of the 295, I selected across art forms and then across demographics. So thinking about gender, disability, family status, living status, I tried to select a representational proportion of recipients. So that of the 80 recipients that I selected, 52 completed the consent forms to undertake the interview. So yeah, that's that process. If that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you. You also mentioned the BIA appears to offer not just financial, but also social validation. Why do you think this sense of being a legitimate artist you mentioned in the report is so crucial and important?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And it's lovely that you've picked up on this question, because I think it could really be explored far more than I did in the report. And I think it's something I will come back to, or I intend to come back to. And the sense of validation was really interesting. And I think there are two sides to this. There's kind of a historical and a socio-political aspect, which looks at the discourse of cultural policy within Ireland. And that has been historically, a lot of our cultural policy in Ireland has been instrumental. It's been about the experience, how art is experienced is where the funding goes, and the economic value. The basic income is something completely different. It's, it looks at those, it speaks to those objectives that can't be measured. It is about, supporting artists in their creative practice, because it's recognizing that it's a low paid sector. So the discourse around cultural policy really shifted in Ireland around the recession. And it looked, it began to focus on the working conditions of artists and the low pay within the sector, and trying to address, more looking at the structural inequalities. So the discourse really shifted there. And we see that again in the pandemic, where it takes another real shift to actually, bring in a policy that addresses individual practicing artists and to support them in the sector. So for the artists, then the other side of that is that they feel that they feel seen, they feel recognized, they feel that being an artist is now a valid profession, that it is something with intrinsic value and worth, that society, sees it as valuable beyond measurement, beyond, being able to, of its economic value. And that created a real shift for them, that, a lot of people anecdotally, when I was speaking to them, had, especially those who were established, or, they may go in and out of social welfare in their, perhaps being a theatre worker. And they said, you often would be socializing and say, oh, are you working on anything now? And it's this idea that it's not a real profession, that and art had that, kind of, you're an artist, but you must be doing something else though, Yes. What's your real job? So for them, it really felt that they were able to say, well, I'm supported by the state, or, I feel validated in all the work that I've put in, that it is a profession, that I'm well educated, I'm trying really hard to make a living from this, and this is really supporting that. I feel seen, I feel validated, I feel my identity. So there's really two sides to that feeling of social validation, that I think, if you look back of the discourse around cultural policy in Ireland, you'll really see that shifting over the last few decades. And for this kind of culmination, it kind of brings together, or creates a shift really in that discourse towards thinking about art and the value of art for society in a different way, in a way that's not entirely economically measurable.
And could you explain on how financial stability translated into better mental and physical health outcomes among recipients?
Yeah, this is another really interesting one, because when I spoke with recipients of the BIA, of the basic income, that feeling of financial anxiety and the anxiety around precarious working really lifted. That was the first kind of emphasis. And it was, it was really emphatic when you spoke to them about, how that continuous sense of, how am I going to pay the bills? Have I enough work organized this week? Have I enough work this month? What's my 6 weeks? What's coming down the line? That real sense of anxiety was there for a lot of people, and at different, of course, in different degrees. There were some who had underlying anxieties, and there were some who had, mental health challenges and more long-term mental health. So for those who had that sense of anxiety or a sense of, trying to make ends meet, it really, they really felt a relief and a sense of stability, and that, what I'm doing, I can make ends meet, and this is even, maybe I can even save. And that really provided, really was transformative. For those who had mental health challenges, and the pandemic was not easy for a lot of artists, what was interesting is that feeling of relief was there, that peace of mind, that sense. But also Ireland did an interesting thing. It created we have this program called Safe to Create. It's through the Irish Theatre Forum, but they set up something called Minding Creative Minds. And so during the pandemic and just coming out of it, they provided free mental health support for artists and creatives in the field. And they got 12 free sessions. So a lot of people that I spoke to engaged with those and realized that therapy can help them, and so it really, some people use the basic income to even go on and provide private therapy sessions and counselling for themselves. So there was a real effort to recognize the kind of mental strain that being a creative worker, being an artist can impose upon you. Then you have the making ends meet, and then you have being actually able to afford the support. So that really did transform a lot of people's mental health. And physical health was really interesting as well, because you had people saying that they've never they never felt they could afford to go to the doctor. And a lot of them, as they were growing older, it becomes about preventative, having registering and being able to feel. It's mostly about how they feel, so subjective feeling they can afford to go to the doctor, that money is there, that they have that consistent income coming in that they can set aside then to look after their health. But it also meant that people, felt they could go to the dentist. A lot of them had never been to the dentist before or had a regular, sense of dental hygiene, and being able to actually, act upon that. So that was really interesting. And then you had down to, dietary differences, being able to choose better quality food, being able to go to gym, to the, affording gym membership, if it was a certain, maybe they were an actor and needed to have their bodies in a certain way, or a dancer, needing to recover, they felt that then they could address those, whereas they did not feel they could do that previously, or they did not feel they had the financial resources to be able to address those. So it really did, support people in, maintaining their health, addressing any physical or dental health hygiene that arose, and definitely encourage, lifted that sense of anxiety, that financial precarious work can make people feel, and that they're under. And then for long-term mental health, for those who had mental health challenges, were able to privately address those and had the finances. But then long-term mental health, still face huge barriers in terms of work practices, and obstacles and welfare thresholds around receiving work. So those kind of issues still remain. Yeah. That answers that. Yeah. But definitely even, sorry. Go on.
Sorry, you go on. Please.
Well, I was just going to say as well, around mental health and anxiety, feeling calmer, feeling like you have more time, that you're not under that mental stress to achieve, to get the work done, also really relieved. I mean, mental health can be experienced in very different ways. And when you're you're creating that idea, there's a lot of mental strain and effort goes into achieving the outcome that you foresee. So, there's that effort of, you have time to make art, was also, contributed to people's mental health. Yeah, sorry, just want to add that bit in at the end.
Thank you. How did early career versus mid-career versus late career artists experience the BIA differently in terms of ambition, reinvention, or stability, or is there a difference?
Yeah, this was really interesting, because I hadn't really set out to look at different career stages, but that definitely came about talking to people who were emerging or had just established their career. And what was interesting, thinking of those who are just beginning or were young, there was a few things. I mean, some were still living at home, so that was a huge benefit. And we have a kind of housing crisis where being able to afford to move out of home as a young person is becoming very, very difficult. So those who were still living at home had a huge advantage in a way, because they could take unpaid work, they could take internships, but they also did it without the stress. They compared to if they did not have the BIA, because they had that kind of safety net there. So they found, they also don't develop that anxiety and mental strain around having to forge a career. Even though a lot of, mid-career and later people in, say, film or theatre would have had that kind of start to their career where they would have taken unpaid work or, and quite stressful trying to make ends meet at the same time while to try and build a portfolio. So for young and emerging artists, that the BIA really supported them in being able to develop their career and portfolio and make connections and do the work without that added financial responsibility or added financial strain. And those who are mid-career, they really enable them to expand their boundaries. So a lot of them would have talked about, I talk about in the report, adding strings to their bow. And this was really important for those who felt that they had gone so far or had kind of stayed within a certain category or box or discipline. Being able to attend workshops, being able to go out and experience more art, even being able to feel they had the financial resources to, reduce some work and increase others, meant that they had greater visibility in certain areas and enable them to expand their boundaries by taking on or, learning new skills or, using their resources to employ different skill sets onto whatever that, whatever they're doing. It's so different across different art forms to generalize what people do. But it really, for mid-career, they really took the opportunity to expand what it is they do and really develop it. And then for late career, it really was about validation and the continuation of their work, that this felt that they really felt strong in continuing to do what they had always been doing, and that there was validation in that, that they really, that this was the validation they were seeking. And now they had, the resources to maybe increase their work or continue their work with less stress.
And were there any insights on how artists' relationships with their audiences changed, either like through increased visibility, experimentation, or like slower, deeper work?
Yeah, and I guess this comes back to the adding strings to their bow as well, because a lot of them used the BIA to be more visible by attending workshops, by, going for residencies, by collaborating with new collaborators, putting themselves out there. And that was really down as well to the feeling of self-worth and confidence that receiving the BIA gave them. And they really felt like this, and as well, it's a 3-year scheme. So it was, a lot of them would have made a plan as to what they were going to do, what their goals were for within the 3 years. So there was really a sense of, trying to develop, and this was your chance to make these connections. Like, if you don't do it now, when are you going to get a better opportunity of support in a way? So there was a lot of, investing in online courses, new materials, taking on new medium, working in new mediums, new methods, attending the workshops. And, for those who reduced their work, or some who left, part-time work or full-time work altogether to be practicing artists, felt that they could network. A lot of networking opportunities are held during working hours, that, if you're working full-time and your creative practice is networking over here during your working time, you can't always, be available. So a lot of people structured their time differently to be more available, to be more visible, that enable them to, perhaps, you go for a funding application they hadn't, applied for before, or, make that collaboration and be able to pay somebody to collaborate with them. So they really used it in really dynamic ways to expand and experiment and fail, and try again was really important, where, they took risks. It didn't work out. That's okay. But I met somebody new, or I made this connection. And sometimes the art world and creating art is all about trying to network and find out who in your field can do what you're looking for. And that was hugely important for a lot of a lot of different art forms. Yeah.
What insight did you gain about the commercial side of artistic practices and how recipients balance creativity with business development? You already mentioned views, but
yeah, interestingly, I think, there wasn't a lot of people who had a creative practice or had a commercial practice alongside, but for those who did, interestingly, people structured the basic income according to the pay and hours, for instance. So for those who had a commercial side would say, well, for me, the BIA, I use it to pay me 2 days a week to work on my creative practice. And then the other 3 days in the week, it's about business development. And for some artists who didn't even have a commercial side to their practice would also think in that way, whereas I'll work for 4 days a week on my creative practice and 1 day is administration, or, looking for that residency. So in a way, I see them all in terms of business. They see themselves as entrepreneurs in some way, in terms of how do I develop as an artist. But also those with the commercial practice, say, for textile design, where they sell those to a co-op or at a shop or something like that, they would say, it gave them the time to work on creating new designs. So again, taking a day or two a week to actually develop their creative practice, to then have something new to bring to the business. And some then, if you have a film producer, would say that he actually created a film out of solely the basic income. That was what he wanted to do with it. So you have very different ideas and uses of it across the different art forms as well. Some, again, who have a business or a commercial side to their practice would have invested in quality materials. They would have increased the quality of the materials. They use better equipment, online subscriptions that allowed them to network more widely, or to, develop their business. Or they hired more established professionals to support them through their business. So again, they would really, not only some would compartmentalize the business side, and some would then use it to expand and develop their business through materials, online resources, expanding their own skill set, and so on and so forth. So it was really interesting, the different ways that people used it, depending on their art form, and what they were hoping to achieve in the goals within the 3 years. Yeah.
And from a researcher's perspective, what will be the key challenge in scaling the BIA nationally or internationally? Is it political will, funding, public perception, or something else entirely?
Yeah, I think this is also another really interesting question that begs a lot of thinking and more discussion on. And I think Ireland has a key place to play in this, but it also has some really interesting questions to kind of address before we move forward. So we have 6 more months of the basic income, and we still don't know really what's going to happen at the end of it. And I think what Ireland needs to keep in mind, if the BIA is to retained and expanded, how will cultural policy, for instance, respond to an increase in aspiring creatives? If we maintain the BIA, we'll have far more people that are and will be eligible as artists. So how do we organize? How do we fund that? How do we keep that going? How do we grow that? My second thing would be, and a gripe I have, or something to consider, is that the BIA as a basic income, it needs to meet the living wage. As it is, it doesn't even meet the minimum wage standard in Ireland. I think it comes out at like €11.30 an hour if we think over a 37-hour week. We currently are at €13.70, and from the research, even for those who tried to sustain their practice on the basic income alone, it was extremely difficult. It was not possible. They were not meeting their, for rent in Ireland, to meet that even as a standard for, family caring responsibilities. We know that the basic income did not fill a living wage. So that's something to address as well, I think, if Ireland is to continue that. And in that sense, then, is the BIA a permanent support, or is it just a transitional tool to help artists build sustainable practices in a market-driven economy? Is it just a subsistence, or is it just similar to funding, and it just provides a backup, or in what way will it be maintained? And then, if the BIA is retained, how can we invest in the infrastructure that enables artistic work to happen? So if we retain it, then what else can we focus on? How can we build up the infrastructure that artists need to maintain or to enable their work to happen? I saw in my research that a lot of artists find difficulty in accessing studio space, in being able to fund a work environment is very difficult. There's lovely dynamics and interdisciplinary dynamics that happen in studio spaces, and there was a real effort there's a real dearth in our rural communities of studio space and community space to really create. So that's something to think about. Our cultural infrastructure, how can we build that? If we are valuing and retaining the intrinsic worth of creative practice, then how do we support that to be built, considering the inspiring creatives that will come forward should this be retained? So I think political will, of course, funding resources. There's always a lot of debate around funding and the feasibility of a basic income. I think that has been disproven. We have the Basic Income Earth Network that have they've published European research around funding a basic income. And we see it in Ireland as well. The Basic Income for Ireland have also a paper on that. So I really think, Ireland needs to look at it being at the standard of a living wage, that it's not just a fund, and thinking about, art. The whole our funding scheme that we have of state funding does that make art performative? Is it art that is funded becomes legitimate art? Whereas it's another reason why this basic income makes people feel more validated. They haven't objectively been peer reviewed. It is because they are eligible artists. They have been practicing. They fit the definition, which is also interesting. We have so it really sets out a different way of thinking about how art can be supported. And I think that makes this a really interesting research and pilot scheme. And I look forward to the rest of the research that comes from it. In due course. And to see. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're okay. I could talk for ages, I guess, but yeah.
I don't know. But what kind of follow-up projects or development do you think would help build on this project? Not just scale it up, but to support artists in creating more output and.
Yeah, I don't know. So what kind of projects or developments do I think? Well, I think in Ireland, cultural policy is very under-researched. So I think we really need to, grapple with that. And there are some really good cultural academics that are beginning to, bring forward some interesting ideas. I think it'll be political will whether basic income will be addressed. I mean, artists' working conditions, working pay, addressing that being an artist is a profession, that they are highly educated, and that the pay parity needs to come in line with that. I think and I think the basic income has gone some way in addressing that societal perception that artists fund themselves and they have the resources or generational wealth. We need to get beyond the thinking that they're, artists come from all walks of life and don't always have the generational resources to be an artist, and that idea of patronage is gone. Yeah, sorry, your question was what other things do I think needs to be developed for artists?
Yes. What kind of follow-up projects do you think would help?
Yeah, I think building the infrastructure would really help. I think, you know, having cultural spaces being more part of our development plans, of being part of the built environment, that there are more cultural spaces for artists. You know, even in Galway where I live, there is a dearth of cultural spaces for artists to gather and create together. And I think that, and even for, you know, lay people to enjoy that or participate in that or to observe that, they're not visible. So I think making it more, when we democratize art, we also have to make art more visible and the creative process more visible. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. That was all our questions.
Thanks so much, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.